Hey guys, Taki here. In this video, we're going to do a head-to-head comparison against the ROG Ally and the Steam Deck. In doing this video, I selected a bunch of key things that I would want to know more about if I owned one of these devices and I was considering the other one, or if I didn't own either and I was trying to pick which one should be my only device. Let's go to something where the ROG Ally has a clear or convincing lead. This section is going to talk about cooling and fan noise. As I talked about in my ROG Ally first look video, the cooling in this device is really good, and it's good on two levels. The first is that it's a really quiet solution for cooling that we haven't seen in this market yet. The way that they achieve that is through a different way of handling heat compared to other things that this competes with. So what we're going to do is put both of these devices at 15 watt TDP, and then we are going to measure the fan noise from both devices, as well as take a look at the overall temperature of the CPU and GPU. Now, one thing that I do need to point out is that these devices can sound similar at lower TDP. If you're not one to push your Steam Deck above 12 watt TDP, then you won't really have to deal with loud fan noise. The Steam Deck comes with two different options for the fan profile. I'm using the updated fan control mode, which is the quieter option, and this device is using the newer fan that makes less noise. In this example right here, we have this game running at 4 watt TDP, and the fan is only at 2,300 RPM, which is very quiet. To be able to get a real measurement, we're going to have to put these both at 15 watt TDP, and then we're going to have to let them heat up a bit before we can measure the thermals and the sound volume. So we're going to go over to the Steam Deck settings, and I have that set to 4 watt TDP. We're going to bump that all the way up to 15 watt TDP. Then we're going to have to go into the settings to make sure that we're not FPS capped. Okay, now we have this device fully loaded at 15 watt TDP, no FSR, 720p, low settings. I'm going to set this device up on a stand with proper airflow so that way we get an apples to apples comparison. And on the Ally, we need to do the same thing. I've got this now set at 15 watt TDP. We need to wait a bit for the charge drain to update. Right now we're at -16, but this should go a bit higher than it is on the Steam Deck, or at least that's what I would assume. Okay, it seems to stabilize. We're just under 23 watts of total system power at this point. We're going to stand this device up with proper airflow, and then we're going to let it heat up just like the Steam Deck. Okay, both devices have sufficiently heated up, so let's take a look at the stats on the Steam Deck. Right now you can see that the GPU is just under 80 Celsius and the CPU is at 82 Celsius. Our fan is also above 5,000 RPM at this point. What I want to do now is take some measurements of the fan noise at different distances. So I'll put the device on one side of the table like this, and then I will put the sound meter on the other end. This is about how far away your head would be from the device. And then I'm going to move the meter a little closer. And then I'm going to move it all the way to the device. Now let's look at the ROG Ally. You can see that the CPU and GPU temperatures are around 65 Celsius, which is a lot lower than the temperatures on the Steam Deck. Now let's take a look at the sound levels. Just to keep this fair, I'm going to position the meter within range of this fan exhaust. And then let's move it a little closer. And then let's move it all the way up to the device. So yeah, at the high end of the TDP spectrum of the Steam Deck, the ROG Ally has much better cooling in terms of cooling efficiency and sound volume. Even if we max this device out at 30 watt TDP, we still cannot reach the sound levels of the Steam Deck at 15 watt TDP. That is a big difference. Our next section is on controls, and I think this is one that is comfortably in the Steam Deck's corner. The ROG Ally has some buttons that are kind of similar to how they are on the Steam Deck, but I think the Steam Deck has a leg up because a lot of the individual controls in the Steam Deck are really good. Now, if you're a fan of the Steam Deck, I think the two biggest ones are going to be these trackpads. These make playing a lot of games a lot easier, and it means that this device is more versatile than the ROG Ally is. But even if we ignore those, there are still some important differences here between these two devices. Let's start going over them right now. When it comes to the ABXY buttons, I would say that these are both pretty similar between both devices. The ones in the ROG Ally are a bit bigger than they are on the Steam Deck, but they feel about the same to use. Besides that, our next biggest difference is going to be in the analog sticks, and the analog stick in the Steam Deck feels different than the one that's in the ROG Ally. And that's largely because the underlying component is completely different. The Steam Deck uses a joystick that's kind of familiar to the one that's used in an Xbox controller, whereas the ROG Ally uses a component like this. This one is an upgrade over the analog stick that's used in a Joy-Con, but it's not as good as the one that's used in the Steam Deck. The analog stick that's used in the Steam Deck has a bit more resistance than the one that's used in the ROG Ally, and I think it feels a bit better. The D-pad is also an important difference between these two devices. The Steam Deck uses a traditional cross D-pad, whereas the ROG Ally uses a circle D-pad. The D-pad in the Steam Deck isn't great by any stretch of the imagination. There are handhelds that are better than this, but I think the D-pad in the Steam Deck is a bit better than the one that's used in the ROG Ally. This one is my preferred style, and it's really easy to use. This one is good for modern games, but I don't think that it's as good as the Steam Deck when it comes to retro titles. When it comes to the shoulder buttons, we are kind of in an interesting situation. I think the R1 buttons are better on the ROG Ally than they are on the Steam Deck. This one's kind of lower in the shell, and I like the raised buttons on the Ally a bit more. But when it comes to the analog shoulder buttons, there's no comparison here. The Steam Deck shoulder buttons are way better than the ones on the ROG Ally. The resistance, the shape, the ergonomics, everything about this button feels really good to use. The analog trigger on the ROG Ally has a bit more resistance to it, and I don't think this shape feels as good to use as the one in the Steam Deck. When it comes to the back buttons, I think there's really no contest here. The Steam Deck wins handily. Even if we just ignore the fact that we have 2 less buttons on the back, I don't think this style of button feels as good to use as the ones that are in the Steam Deck. And then that just brings us to the controller layout. And this is a bit more subjective, but I would say that the controller layout on the ROG Ally is like a solid A- in terms of comfort and ergonomics. But when it comes to the Steam Deck layout, I would say this is a solid A or an A+. It takes a bit to get used to, and I think if you're looking at this, it doesn't seem like it would be that good, but this layout is really awesome for playing a wide selection of games. Like it's a jack of all trades. I just like how easy it is to shift between all of the input options without having to make big movements. This next section is going to be a smaller one, but I want to talk about the ergonomics or comfort of these devices. The ROG Ally weighs a bit less than the Steam Deck, but I think the ergonomics of the Steam Deck help to hide that difference. Now, I might be a little biased here, but I would say that the ergonomics on the Steam Deck are easily in the S tier. I love these rounded edges. They feel really nice in the palm of my hand. I like the resting position for my fingers on R2 and L2, and I just really enjoy my time whenever I'm holding this device in my hand. The team behind the ROG Ally made some interesting decisions here. I would say that the ergonomics or comfort of the ROG Ally are A tier. They're not S tier, not quite at S tier. They could have made some improvements to this to make this S tier, but this is easily A tier for me. It's not uncomfortable to use by any stretch of the imagination. Even using this for like 10 hours in a stretch doesn't feel bad, but it is not as comfortable to use as the Steam Deck. That is just easy to see. There's not really one thing that I can point to that keeps the ROG in the A tier instead of the S tier. There's just a lot of things together that don't make this as comfortable as the Steam Deck. If you asked me to pick one thing that I didn't like about the Steam Deck, or I wish was better, it would be the screen. Both of these devices have a 7-inch screen, but the aspect ratio of the screen is a bit different. The Steam Deck uses a 16:10 aspect ratio, and it's a portrait screen that is rotated to landscape. That's why we have these big bezels on the left and the right side with small ones on the top and the bottom. The ROG Ally is the opposite of this. It's a 16:9 screen, but it's native landscape, so it has bigger bezels on the top and the bottom, and smaller ones on the left and the right side. The resolutions between these are also different. The Steam Deck comes in at a modest 800p, while the ROG Ally comes in at 1080p. This is a difference that you can see when you're using the device, but we'll talk more about that in a moment. To be able to analyze this further, we're going to need to jump into some games, and I have a few games that I selected that illustrate the difference between these two panels. Our first example is Donkey Kong Country for the Super Nintendo. I have both of these games running in RA right now with 4:3 scaling. You can see that that picture is a bit bigger on the Steam Deck than it is on the ROG Ally, but the difference isn't that significant. So let's start off by talking about the Steam Deck. This is a good representation of how picture quality looks like on this device. The Steam Deck isn't known for color accuracy or good saturation, and right now I'm not using Vibrant Deck to improve the picture quality because I want an apples to apples comparison. I will turn that on in just a moment. Now with a static game like this, if this is the only device that you're using, you probably won't be able to pick out that the color accuracy isn't that high because you're going to get used to this picture quality. When we switch between the ROG Ally and this device, I want you to focus on the green textures that you can see on screen. When we switch over to the ROG Ally, you can see that there is more saturation in those green textures, along with basically everywhere else on the screen, and you can see that this screen appears to have a higher contrast ratio. On the Steam Deck, we can go into the Vibrant Deck plugin, and we can turn that on for a boost in saturation. I have this set to 115 now because that looks the best for my eyes, but you can really go ham on this and increase the saturation more if you want to. It's important to note that this is not a free change. When you increase the saturation, you do decrease other things like contrast ratio, which is already not that great on the Steam Deck. but I think 115 is a safe compromise for the added saturation that you get in the panel. Now let's go to the next title. With this kind of game, it's a bit easier to see the added saturation that we get in the green background textures, but there's also some difference in the dirt down here that is caused by the difference in the screen's color temperature. Here's a close-up of the ROG Ally, and here's the Steam Deck. I want you to focus on the ghosting that happens around these brown blocks as I run back and forth. Now let's see how that looks on the ROG Ally with black frame insertion. This benefit is really easy to see on retro titles like this that side scroll, but the main benefit here is that the ROG Ally has less ghosting when this option is turned on. I have one more emulated title that I want to take a look at. This is Spyro Year of the Dragon for the PS1, and the game looks great on both of these devices, but the ROG Ally looks a lot better. It has better dynamic range, and the overall saturation of the picture looks a lot better than it does on the Steam Deck with the Vibrant Deck plugin. The ground textures have a decent amount of saturation to them, and they aren't blown out like they are on the Steam Deck. Now, the strange thing about all of this is there are games where you would expect to see a difference between these two devices in favor of the ROG Ally, but it really doesn't seem that way. Leave your thoughts down in the comments below. Which one of these do you think looks better? Battery life is an important metric on these devices, and it's interesting because both of these devices have the same size battery. Battery life isn't great on either one of them, but the battery life is better on the Steam Deck because it does better at lower power due to the alien technology that AMD forgot how to use after they made this processor. In practice, that means you can come in here and set the TDP down to 3 watts, and you will be able to play some games on the Steam Deck that you cannot touch on the ROG Ally. I want to do two things in this section. The first thing that I want to do is find out the minimum TDP that we can run a simple 2D game on both devices. Then we'll take a look at the power consumption of both devices to get an idea of the battery life that they would have under a best case scenario. We'll do the exact same thing at 15 watt TDP since that is the maximum that's supported on the Steam Deck. For our 2D game, we have Freedom Planet. I'm going to come in here and set a per game profile, and then I'm going to go down to the TDP controls and I'm going to set this to 3 watts. This is a game that can run at 60 FPS at that low TDP. You can see right now that the charge drain is just under 7 watts for this level of performance. Let's do the same thing on the ROG Ally. If I use custom TDP controls on the ROG Ally, the lowest TDP that I can run this game is just under 4.5 watts. It can go as low as 4 watts, but it tends to be around 4.2 watts. This gives us a charge drain of 6.7 watts of total system power. You'll also notice that both devices have about 50% battery, and that was done for a good reason. Battery readings are a bit more accurate around this level, and both these devices have the same size battery, so the readings should be comparable between both devices. But let's take this to an even higher extreme by lowering the brightness to the minimum on both devices. So we'll come over here into the Steam Deck, go to the brightness settings, and lower this down to the minimum level. This device gets a bit lower than the ROG Ally, so I need to increase the ISO on my camera. You'll now notice that the alien technology in the Steam Deck is putting in a lot of work. We have a total charge drain of just under 5 watts for this game at minimum brightness level, and this is a brightness level that is perfect for playing at night. On the ROG Ally with the minimum brightness level, our charge drain is just a bit higher at 5 watts. Now I do need to point out that you cannot achieve this level of performance with the stock Asus tools. You need to use external tools to be able to set the TDP down this low. But it's pretty cool to see that both devices are comparable. Okay, so now I have a higher end example. This is Stray running at low settings. The Steam Deck is running at 800p, whereas the ROG Ally is running at 720p. If we look at the total power consumption of the Steam Deck, we are around 26 watts of power, and we're getting around 70 FPS in this scene right here. The fan is also running a lot faster at 6,000 RPM for this title. On the ROG Ally, we're sitting at just under 25 watts of total system power, and the average FPS is a lot higher at around 93. Just take into account that this is at 720p resolution, whereas the Steam Deck is at 800p. 800p isn't available to us on the ROG Ally, but we can add a resolution scale on the Steam Deck to make this a bit more fair. So if we just come in here and set the resolution scale to 90%, this should be pretty even between both devices. Now the FPS gap isn't as wide, but you can see that our charge drain still favors the ROG Ally over the Steam Deck at 15 watt TDP. The important thing to note here is that the Steam Deck has diminished returns as you get closer to 15 watt TDP. For example, at 10 watt TDP with this title, we can still get a decent FPS, but if we change 10 watt TDP on the ROG Ally, we do not. The charge drain isn't equal right now, so let's increase the TDP on the ROG Ally so it matches the total power consumption of the Steam Deck to see where we lie. Once we match these devices based on their total power consumption, the difference between them isn't actually that great. It's still in favor of the Steam Deck, but it's not as far as it was on older AMD chips like the Ryzen 6000 series. In this example, we're just a bit over 20 watts of total system power on the ROG Ally for around 54 FPS, whereas the Steam Deck is at 19.5 watts for 58 FPS. If I change the TDP down to 11 watts, the total power consumption goes under the Steam Deck, so this is as close as I could get both devices. I would probably need 11.5 or 11.75 watts of TDP on the ROG Ally to perfectly match the Steam Deck in this scenario. So all that is to say, you're going to get better battery life on the Steam Deck. If you use custom tools that aren't available on the ROG Ally by default, you can get similar performance at low or high TDP. The thing that you need to be aware of is the total power consumption of the device needs to be taken into account when you're doing these comparisons. If I just set this to 10 watt versus 10 watt TDP, then the Steam Deck wins by a landslide. But if I change this to 12 watt TDP versus 10 watt TDP on the Steam Deck, then the gap is much smaller. But the total power consumption is very close. And you'll notice that the available charge on both devices is about the same. 32% on the ROG Ally and 33% on the Steam Deck. Without running this with DXVK, this is about as apples to apples as you can get. This section is all about audio quality, and this is going to be another one that goes directly to the ROG Ally. Before I did these side-by-side tests, my impression was that these guys were pretty close in terms of audio quality, but that does not seem to be the case. So just quickly some points that I want to make. The speakers on the ROG Ally are much louder than the ones on the Steam Deck. When the volume is at 66 on the ROG Ally, it is about equal to the Steam Deck at 100%. Going from 66 to 100 on the ROG Ally is a huge increase, and this thing will pump out volume way louder than you would expect. In terms of the audio quality itself, my general impressions are that the audio quality on this is a bit richer than it is on the Steam Deck. The bass is a lot better, and the audio is very clear. But I'm going to let you make the judgment for yourself. I'm going to be placing a microphone right around the speaker grills, and I'm going to have these set to 66 and 100% volume respectively. If you have a set of good headphones, I hope that you can notice the difference between the two devices. Let's get started with the tests. My first ROG Ally video had a pretty sizable amount of time dedicated to the software situation at this point, and like I pointed out, it is kind of jank in this early stage for the software that is available to reviewers. I don't expect it to still be jank when the product ships, so let's just disregard the controller wonkiness and just focus on the rest of the software compared to the Steam Deck software. I think an appropriate assessment would be that the software on the Steam Deck is better than the software on the ROG Ally. For a gaming device, it's really hard to beat all of the stuff that Valve put into this device. It's good for experienced users that want to get in here and really tinker with their device, and it's easy to pick up if you're a novice to anything, even computers. So if we just look at the base software experience, I would say that Valve is killing it right now. It's really hard to beat SteamOS. Both of these devices can run Windows, and both of them can run SteamOS, and I would say that I would be more likely to install SteamOS on the ROG Ally than installing Windows on any of my Steam Decks. If you want to do more than just gaming, then SteamOS probably isn't going to cut it for you. There's a lot more stuff that you can do over on Windows, so it kind of really comes down to what you want to use the device for. But if we're just sticking to gaming only, then SteamOS is the way to go at this point. Microsoft has a lot of experience with gaming consoles, so they could do a lot of things in Windows to make this a better platform for handhelds, and I hope they do that. There are a lot of fine-tune adjustments that ROG did to this device to make it easier to use on Windows, but there's still a lot more that could be done. We only have 3 sections left in this video, but I did want to touch on third-party support. Obviously, the Steam Deck has been on the market for a long time now, so the third-party support both in hardware and software is really good at this point. For almost anything that you could think of, there is a solution on the Steam Deck. But I want to focus on third-party hardware support. So on the repairability side, Valve did a really good thing by partnering with iFixit for replacement parts on the Steam Deck. Some of those parts are pretty expensive, but it is good to see that you can just buy stuff from them and then fix your own deck if you want to. To my knowledge, I haven't heard of any such commitment like that on the ROG Ally, and I would like to see one. These devices are pretty big investments, so if something ends up breaking, it's pretty cool to be able to fix it on your own without having to worry about sending it out to somebody else, especially after your warranty is over. Another thing that Valve did that ROG has yet to do is they released the 3D files for the shell of this device, and that opened up a huge ecosystem of companies that are now making products for the Steam Deck. You have skins, docks, cases, custom back shell mods, fan attachments. The sky's really the limit when it comes to the Steam Deck. ROG has yet to do that with the Ally, and that's a shame because there are a lot of accessories that I know would be killer on this device given my experience with it so far. The companies that make accessories for the Steam Deck want to be able to start making accessories for the ROG Ally as soon as possible, but they're going to have to wait until this device fully ships out to retail customers before they can get their hands on them to start the R&D work to make those accessories. That's kind of unfortunate because that means when you get your hands on this next month, there's not going to be a whole lot of accessories available to you on the market. It's a really simple fix, and I hope that ROG considers supporting third-party developers for this platform. Emulation is a big reason why people buy these devices, so I wanted to round out this video by talking about it specifically. The first thing that you need to know is there's a lot of overlap when it comes to the ROG Ally and the Steam Deck. Both of these devices can emulate a ton of systems with a lot of overlap between them. They can also do that at very low TDP. In this example, we have Kingdom Hearts 2 for the PS2 running at 1080p resolution. This is rendered at 1080p even though the Steam Deck doesn't have a 1080p screen. On the Steam Deck, you can see that we're using about 10 watts of total system power to emulate this game. However, on the ROG Ally, we need a bit more power with 6 watt TDP and a total charge drain of just over 10 watts. One thing to be aware of here is that our battery level is at 59%, whereas on the Steam Deck, it is 47%. So this should be a bit higher when the battery level is matched with the Steam Deck. But that's just to say that for a lot of these systems, you're going to be getting the same performance for about the same battery life. So for people that are asking which device they should consider when it comes to emulation, I would say that depends on the type of emulation that you want to do. The ROG Ally excels in the higher end systems. So you're going to notice a difference whenever you're doing any high-end emulation. I would say the biggest difference that you'll notice is probably going to be in PS3 or Xbox 360, where the Steam Deck doesn't really have the CPU juice to be able to cut it. Outside of that, you'll probably also notice a difference in Xbox emulation. PS2 emulation is decent on the Steam Deck, so I would say the only way you're going to really see a difference is if you're playing some really demanding PS2 games at very high rendering resolutions. If you're not doing that, then there's not going to be a big difference between these two devices. The last system where you will notice a difference between these two devices is in Switch emulation. The Steam Deck can emulate a ton of Switch games, but the ROG Ally will be able to do that at very high resolutions. If you're going to connect either device to an external monitor, the ROG Ally will be able to render those games at very high resolutions. So if you're someone that is considering buying one of these devices for emulation, I would say you need to take a look at what emulation you really want to do and then see which device gives you the performance that you need. If you're just going to do retro emulation, you can't go wrong with either of these devices. I just want to wrap up this video with some closing advice. If you don't have either one of these devices and you're trying to make a decision, I would say the easiest way to know if the Steam Deck is the right device for you is if you want a very simple device to use. If you're new to handheld gaming devices, the Steam Deck is a very welcoming platform without a steep learning curve. It can play a lot of games and there's a ton of resources available online to tell you how to use the device. If you want to play some really demanding PC games, it does have some limitations because the processor in here isn't that powerful on the high end, and that's where the ROG Ally excels. It has a lot more potential, especially if you plug in the device and connect it to an external screen. It can do everything that the Steam Deck can do and then some. It's just not as novice friendly as the Steam Deck is. If I didn't have either of these devices, I would pick the Steam Deck over the ROG Ally if I was on a very tight budget. This thing comes in at $400 for the base model, and that's perfectly capable of doing everything that the higher end models can do. If my budget could go a bit further, then I would go with the ROG Ally because that can do a lot more stuff than the Steam Deck can, and it should be a while before it is outclassed by other devices. Let me know your thoughts down below. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see another one, feel free to take a look at my big emulation video on the Steam Deck. I'm planning on making another one like that for the ROG Ally. Happy gaming, everyone. Taki out.